across the galaxy, every species has a word for the unstoppable force that appears when all hope is lost. The Zephyrians call it Kethmera, the final tide. The crystalline vortex whisper Shul Thyss, the breaking point. The gas giant dwelling Nephrons rumble Gorthmalin, the last resort. But when the Galactic Council first encountered humans, they didn't know any of these words would soon apply to a single species. It started as bureaucratic efficiency. Humans were small, numerous, and seemed to thrive in impossible conditions. Their military forces appeared average by galactic standards. No energy shields, no plasma cannons, no faster-than-light personal weapons. Just kinetic projectiles, explosive devices, and an unsettling tendency to smile before battle. So the Council filed them under Special Forces, not because they were elite, but because they didn't fit any other category. The first species to request human Special Forces assistance was the peaceful Altrians, whose mining colonies were being raided by Kravex pirates. They expected a small, professional force to handle discreet security operations. They got something else entirely. Within 3 months, the word human became synonymous with run in 17 different galactic languages. The Kravex Pirate Confederation, which had terrorized the Outer Rim for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, erased. Their bases were empty, their fleets were scattered atoms, and their leaders had vanished so completely that even mentioning their names in bars caused uncomfortable silences. But that was just the beginning. As word spread through the galaxy's communication networks, a pattern emerged. Wherever humans were deployed as special forces, the impossible became routine. Hopeless situations turned into decisive victories. Enemy forces that had never known defeat would suddenly retreat at the mere rumor of human involvement. The galaxy learned new phrases, human rules, the terrifying realization that the laws of physics seemed more like suggestions to this species. Human time. The countdown to when a hopeless situation would somehow reverse completely. Human logic. The process by which certain defeat transformed into overwhelming victory through methods no one else could understand. Now, as the greatest threat in galactic history emerges from the dark space between stars, every species faces the same choice that haunted their ancestors. Call for human special forces and pray they can control what they've unleashed. Because the galaxy was about to remember why evolution had given every sentient species the same primal instinct. When something seems too dangerous to exist, it probably does. And humanity had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. Ambassador Thexaniel of the Zephyrian Diplomatic Corps stared at the data tablet with growing confusion. The information displayed defied every categorization system the Galactic Council had developed over 3,000 years of interspecies contact. Before him sat 2 representatives of the species that had recently petitioned for council membership, beings that called themselves humans. The smaller one, who had introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chun, appeared to be their scientific representative. Her companion, Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, bore the bearing of a military officer despite lacking the imposing physical characteristics typical of warrior species. Both creatures were bipedal, carbon-based, and remarkably average in almost every measurable way. Your application presents certain complications, Thexanael said, his translator rendering his clicking speech into their primitive audio-based language. Your species lacks the advanced energy manipulation capabilities of the Vortex, the hive mind efficiency of the Nexary, or the technological integration of the synthetic collective. Dr. Chin smiled, an expression that Thexanael found unsettling for reasons he couldn't articulate. We understand we're not the most impressive species you've encountered, Ambassador. Indeed, your weapons technology appears to rely primarily on kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives, methods most species abandoned millennia ago. Your spacecraft barely achieve faster-than-light travel, and your energy shields are. Thexanael paused, checking his notes. Non-existent. Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. We've always been resourceful, Ambassador. Sometimes the old ways work better than people expect. Fexenal's tentacles twitched with nervous energy. Something about the human's tone reminded him of a predator discussing hunting strategies. But that was impossible. The biometric scans had classified humans as omnivores with limited physical capabilities. Their muscle density was average, their reaction times adequate, but not exceptional, and their individual combat capacity ranked somewhere between Altrian civilians and Nephron larvae. The Council requires all member species to contribute to galactic security. Fexenal continued. Given your limitations, we propose classifying your military forces as special forces, suitable for discrete operations requiring minimal technological infrastructure. Dr. Chun exchanged a glance with the colonel that lasted exactly 1.7 seconds. Fexenal had observed enough species to recognize silent communication when he saw it, but human facial expressions remained largely incomprehensible to his compound eyes. What kind of operations? Rodriguez asked. Counter-piracy, colonial security, perhaps some peacekeeping duties in low-threat sectors. Nothing that would require front-line engagement with major military powers. The humans accepted the classification without argument, though Fexenal noticed they asked unusually detailed questions about rules of engagement, collateral damage protocols, and something they termed mission scope creep. He filed their responses under species-specific paranoia and approved their application. 3 weeks later, the first request for human special forces assistance arrived from the Altrian Colonial Administration. The Altrians were among the galaxy's most peaceful species. Their entire civilization had evolved around consensus building and conflict avoidance. They had colonized 17 systems through careful negotiation and mutual benefit agreements with local wildlife and ecosystem preservation as their highest priority. Their military consisted entirely of lightly armed security forces trained primarily in crowd control and emergency response. Unfortunately, peace had made them ideal targets for the Kravex Pirate Confederation. Fexenal reviewed the situation reports with growing dismay. The Kravex had been raiding Altrian colonies for 6 months, systematically stripping them of resources while carefully avoiding damage that might provoke Council intervention. They operated just below the threshold that would justify deploying major military assets, but their cumulative impact was devastating the Altrian economy. Traditional solutions had failed. Diplomatic protests were ignored. Economic sanctions affected uninvolved systems more than the pirates. The Nexri had offered to establish defensive positions, but their hive ships were too large and expensive for the limited scope of the problem. The Vortex had suggested bombardment solutions that would render the colonies uninhabitable. Humans, however, had requested only 2 pieces of information: the location of pirate bases and confirmation that no Altrian civilians were being held hostage. That's all. Fexenal had asked during the briefing. You don't need tactical assessments, enemy strength evaluations, or logistical support projections. The human coordinator, a calm woman named Commander Lisa Park, had simply shrugged. We'll figure it out when we get there. Now, 2 weeks after a single human transport vessel had departed for the Altrian colonies, Fexenal found himself staring at reports that made no sense. The first Kravex base had simply stopped responding to communications. Long-range sensors detected no energy signatures consistent with battle damage, no debris fields indicating ship-to-ship combat, and no distress signals. The base was intact but completely lifeless. The second base had been discovered by an Altrian merchant vessel that found it abandoned, with all equipment carefully disabled and a message burned into the main hangar floor in perfect galactic standard: closed for business. Management. The third base hadn't been found at all. Long-range scans indicated it should exist at the provided coordinates, but 3 separate reconnaissance missions had found nothing but empty space and a faint energy signature that one Nexri hive mind had described as wrong in a way that made their collective consciousness uncomfortable. Most disturbing of all, intercepted Kravex communications had begun exhibiting what Council linguists termed linguistic breakdown. Pirate transmissions now consisted largely of repetitive warnings about the silent ships and hunters that don't announce themselves. Several raiding parties had abandoned profitable operations mid-mission, citing presence indicators that their sensors couldn't identify. FXNAL's investigation had uncovered no evidence of human military action. Their transport vessel had been detected in the general vicinity of each incident, but always at distances too great to explain direct involvement. No weapons signatures had been recorded, no human communications had been intercepted, and no physical evidence suggested their presence at any of the affected locations. Yet somehow, the Kravex Pirate Confederation was exhibiting behavior patterns consistent with a species under systematic predation pressure. The breaking point came when Kravex war leader Gorth himself, a creature who had terrorized the Outer Rim for over 40 years, transmitted an unconditional surrender directly to the Altrean colonial administration. The message was brief. The hunting grounds are yours. We seek prey elsewhere. Within hours, every Kravex vessel within 50 light-years of Altrean space had jumped to faster-than-light travel, abandoning operations, equipment, and, in some cases, entire base installations. The Altrean colonial administration declared the piracy crisis resolved and submitted a glowing efficiency report praising human special forces for their discreet and effective intervention with minimal collateral impact on local ecosystems. FXNAL found himself facing a problem that had no precedent in Council history. Somehow, a species classified as having minimal military capability had achieved results that would have been impressive for the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. They had done so without creating detectable evidence of their methods, without causing collateral damage, and without apparently violating any Council regulations regarding proportional response. His formal report classified the entire incident as an anomalous positive outcome and recommended continued monitoring of human special forces operations. Privately, he began researching every scrap of information available about human military history and found patterns that made his exoskeleton itch with unidentifiable anxiety. Humans, it seemed, had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to hunt creatures bigger, stronger, and better armed than themselves. They had developed technologies specifically designed to kill from distances that prevented retaliation. They had created military doctrines based on the assumption that every enemy possessed superior capabilities and must therefore be defeated through methods the enemy couldn't predict or counter. Most unsettling of all, they had developed a concept they called psychological warfare, the idea that victory could be achieved by making enemies afraid to fight rather than by destroying them directly. As FXNL submitted his reports and filed the incident as resolved, he couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy had just witnessed something unprecedented. For the first time in Council history, a military operation had succeeded not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through something far more primitive and infinitely more terrifying. The humans had won by making their enemies afraid of shadows, and they had done it so quietly that no one was entirely sure what had actually happened. In the weeks that followed, word of the Altrean success spread through the galaxy's communication networks with the speed that only really interesting gossip can achieve. The story mutated with each retelling. Humans had used invisible ships, deployed planet-killing weapons with surgical precision, or somehow convinced the pirates to destroy themselves. None of these versions were entirely accurate, but FXNAL was beginning to suspect they weren't entirely wrong either. The requests for human special forces assistance began arriving at an alarming rate 0.6 months after the Altrean incident. Ambassador FXNL found himself drowning in reports that defied every principle of military science he had studied. His office walls were covered with star charts marking human special forces deployments, each one representing another impossible outcome that the Galactic Council's best analysts couldn't explain. The pattern had started innocuously enough. Small conflicts, minor territorial disputes, local security issues that fell below the threshold for major military intervention. The kind of problems that typically festered for years while diplomats negotiated and larger powers weighed the cost of involvement against potential benefits. Humans had requested these assignments specifically. We prefer the complicated ones, Commander Park had explained during her last briefing. Big wars are expensive and messy. Small problems that everyone thinks are impossible. Those are interesting. The Kepler Mining Consortium crisis should have dragged on for months. Separatist miners had seized control of asteroid installations in the Vega sector, declaring independence and threatening to destroy the mining platforms rather than surrender. The installations were too valuable to bombard, too heavily fortified for conventional assault, and too politically sensitive for heavy-handed solutions. 3 weeks after a human special forces team had arrived in system, the Separatist leadership had contacted consortium headquarters with an offer to negotiate. The terms were remarkably reasonable: improved working conditions, profit-sharing agreements, and autonomous governance within consortium oversight. Both sides praised the neutral mediation that had made the breakthrough possible. No one could identify who had done the mediating. The human team's ship had been detected in the outer system, but had never approached the installations. No communications between humans and either faction had been recorded. Somehow, negotiations had begun spontaneously when both sides received anonymous data packets containing detailed analyses of their positions, projected outcomes of continued conflict, and suggested compromise solutions that addressed everyone's core concerns. The Separatist leader later described the turning point as realizing that someone understood our situation better than we did. The consortium representative had used almost identical language. FEX and AL had filed the incident under unexplained diplomatic success and tried to move on. But the reports kept coming. The Rigel Station hostage crisis had ended when the terrorist organization holding 200 civilians simply left. Security footage showed them methodically packing their equipment, boarding their ships, and departing the system without explanation. Intercepted communications suggested they had received credible intelligence that their home bases were under immediate threat, though no such threat existed according to any intelligence service in the galaxy. The Human Special Forces team assigned to the crisis had been in a completely different star system when the terrorists fled. Their transport logs showed no movement toward Rigel Station. Their communications contained no references to the situation, and their commanding officer had expressed surprise when informed the crisis was over. Yet somehow, the terrorist organization had disbanded entirely within a week of the humans' assignment to the case. Their members had scattered across the galaxy, abandoning weapons, equipment, and operational plans that had taken years to develop. The border war between the Canopus Federation and the Sirius Alliance had been raging for 3 years when both governments requested human special forces assistance. Not to end the war. Both sides insisted they wanted to continue fighting, but to reduce civilian casualties while maintaining operational effectiveness. It was an impossible request. The war had devolved into a series of brutal planetary sieges where civilian populations were trapped between competing forces. Traditional peacekeeping approaches required separating the combatants, but both governments had explicitly refused to consider ceasefires. The human response had been to deploy small teams to both sides simultaneously, not as advisors or observers, but as efficiency consultants offering to help both militaries achieve their objectives with reduced resource expenditure. Within 2 months, the nature of the entire conflict had changed. Both armies had begun adopting new tactical approaches that somehow managed to be more decisive while producing dramatically fewer casualties. Siege operations transformed into precision strikes against military targets. Civilian evacuation procedures became so efficient that population centers emptied before battles began. Most remarkably, both sides began achieving their strategic objectives faster than ever before, while simultaneously creating conditions that made continued fighting increasingly pointless. The Canopus Federation successfully secured their disputed territory claims, while the Sirius Alliance achieved their primary goal of demonstrating military capability to potential future adversaries. The war ended when both governments declared victory on the same day and began negotiating trade agreements to rebuild the disputed systems. Each side credited their human advisors with revolutionizing their military effectiveness, though neither could explain exactly what changes had been implemented. FXNAL's investigation revealed that the human teams had provided both militaries with identical training programs focused on tactical efficiency and objective-oriented planning. The humans claimed they had simply helped both sides clarify their actual goals and develop more effective methods of achieving them. The fact that achieving those goals had made the war strategically pointless was apparently an unintended consequence. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Every human special forces deployment resulted in outcomes that satisfied all parties involved while somehow resolving the underlying conflicts in ways no one had anticipated. The humans never claimed credit for these successes, never demanded recognition, and consistently acted surprised when briefed on the results of their deployments. But Fexenel was beginning to notice subtler patterns that filled him with a growing sense of unease. Human Special Forces teams requested unusually detailed briefings about non-military factors, cultural histories, economic dependencies, psychological profiles of leadership, social dynamics within populations, historical grievances that predated current conflicts. They asked questions about supply chains, communication networks, family relationships between opposing leaders, and seemingly irrelevant details about local customs and belief systems. They also had a disturbing tendency to focus on information that other species considered unimportant. While traditional military analysts studied weapons capabilities and force dispositions, humans wanted to know about morale, logistics, personal motivations, and what they termed cognitive vulnerabilities. Every problem has pressure points, Commander Park had explained when questioned about their methods. Find the right pressure point, apply exactly the right amount of force, and systems tend to reorganize themselves into more stable configurations. The explanation sounded reasonable until Fexenel realized that humans were treating entire civilizations as systems to be analyzed and modified. They weren't winning conflicts through superior firepower or advanced technology. They were winning by understanding their opponents better than the opponents understood themselves. The Proxima corporate wars should have provided definitive evidence of human capabilities. 12 major corporations have been engaged in a complex multi-sided economic conflict involving market manipulation, industrial sabotage, and limited military action across 17 star systems. The web of competing interests, shifting alliances, and escalating retaliation had created a situation too complicated for traditional intervention methods. FexNAL had authorized Human Special Forces deployment partly to see what would happen when they faced a problem with no clear solution. 6 weeks later, the corporate wars had resolved into the most successful business partnership in galactic history. All 12 corporations had restructured into a cooperative federation that controlled their respective market sectors through collaborative rather than competitive strategies. Profits had increased for every participant. Operational efficiency had improved dramatically, and the entire economic conflict had transformed into a model of interspecies commercial cooperation. The transformation had been so smooth that no one could identify exactly when it had happened. Corporate executives described a gradual realization that cooperation offered better outcomes than competition, but couldn't explain what had triggered this insight. The humans had provided consulting services to various corporations throughout the conflict, but their contributions seemed limited to efficiency analyses and strategic planning assistance. Yet somehow, 12 antagonistic corporations had simultaneously discovered that their best interests aligned perfectly with ending the conflict and forming the most profitable business alliance in known space. FexNAL was forced to conclude that humans possessed capabilities that their technology and biology couldn't explain. They were somehow able to analyze complex social systems, identify critical intervention points, and implement changes that cascaded through entire civilizations without leaving detectable evidence of manipulation. It was a terrifying realization. The final confirmation came during the Centauri system crisis, when a local government requested human assistance with what they described as a minor internal security issue. Revolutionary groups had been conducting increasingly sophisticated attacks against government installations, utilizing technology and tactics that suggested off-world support. The humans had requested only basic briefing materials and demographic data for the system's population. They had deployed a single team of 6 individuals and established a base of operations in the system's outer asteroid belt, apparently to monitor communications traffic. 3 days later, the revolutionary movement had collapsed entirely, not through arrest or military action, but through internal dissolution. Cell leaders had begun turning themselves into authorities, claiming they had been deceived about the movement's true objectives. Intercepted communications revealed that someone had provided revolutionary groups with detailed evidence of corruption and manipulation by their off-world sponsors. The proof had been so comprehensive and convincing that the entire revolutionary network had shifted its focus from opposing the local government to investigating and exposing the external forces that had been exploiting their grievances. Within a week, they had provided authorities with enough evidence to arrest 17 off-world intelligence operatives and dismantle a network that had been operating in the sector for over a decade. The humans had accomplished this by providing accurate information to people who had been operating on false assumptions. They had simply helped everyone involved understand what was actually happening and allowed natural consequences to resolve the conflict. It was an elegant solution that left FXNAL deeply disturbed. Humans weren't winning through deception or manipulation. They were winning by revealing truth. They understood that most conflicts arose from misunderstanding, poor information, and people working at cross purposes without realizing it. By providing clarity and accurate analysis, they enabled others to make better decisions that naturally led to more stable outcomes. The terrifying part was how consistently this approach worked. Humans seemed to understand social dynamics and psychological patterns that other species hadn't even recognized as significant. They could predict how individuals and groups would respond to specific information, how changes in one part of the system would cascade through other parts, and how to create conditions that encourage cooperation rather than conflict. They had weaponized empathy and turned understanding into a military asset more powerful than any technology the galaxy had ever developed. As reports continued flooding in from across Council space, FXNAL realized that humanity had been systematically demonstrating capabilities that made them potentially the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered. Not because they were aggressive or militaristic, but because they were so effective at achieving objectives that no one could predict what they might accomplish if they ever decided to pursue goals beyond peaceful conflict resolution. The galaxy was about to discover just how valid that concern would prove to be. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called by the Nexary Collective, and when a hive mind that spanned 14 star systems requested immediate deliberation, the galaxy listened. FXNAL floated in his designated chamber, watching as representatives from 43 species materialized through holographic projection or physical presence, their collective anxiety creating an almost tangible tension in the council chamber. The Nexary speaker, a towering crystalline entity that served as the voice for 17 billion interconnected minds, began without preamble. We have detected an anomaly that threatens the stability of galactic civilization. The species designated human has demonstrated capabilities that exceed our current understanding of socio-political manipulation and strategic influence. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Over the past year, human special forces have been deployed to resolve conflicts across 200 systems, with a success rate that approached statistical impossibility. More disturbing still, each resolution had strengthened the overall stability of the affected regions, while somehow increasing human influence without apparent intent or effort. The patterns suggest systematic infiltration of our civilization, continued the Nexary speaker. Humans have achieved positions of influence within military, commercial, and governmental organizations across the galaxy. They claim these placements are coincidental results of their conflict resolution successes, but the mathematical probability indicates deliberate strategy. Admiral Korthax of the Regelian Defense Force activated his translation matrix. Our intelligence networks have identified human advisors in over 300 critical installations. They arrived as temporary consultants and remained as permanent assets, always at the invitation of local leadership who credit them with unprecedented improvements in operational effectiveness. This was the heart of the problem that had haunted Thexanael for months. Humans didn't conquer or subvert, they helped. They improved efficiency, reduced conflicts, and created conditions where everyone benefited from their presence. But their cumulative influence was approaching levels that would give them effective control over galactic civilization without anyone realizing it had happened. Dr. Chun and Colonel Rodriguez materialized in the center of the chamber via holographic projection from Earth, their expressions showing polite confusion rather than the defensive postures typical of species facing accusations of expansionist ambitions. "We appreciate the Council's concerns," Dr. Chun began, "but I'm not sure we understand the nature of the problem. Our personnel have been assigned to positions requested by local governments and organizations. We've consistently operated within established protocols and achieved the objectives we were asked to accomplish." The Vortex Queen, her crystalline body pulsing with agitated energy patterns, responded with harmonic tones that translated as barely controlled alarm. "You have achieved objectives that no other species has successfully accomplished. The Kravex Pirate Confederation, which had terrorized the Outer Rim for centuries, has completely disbanded. The border wars that had consumed the Canopus and Sirius sectors for generations have ended in unprecedented cooperation. Corporate conflicts that typically require decades of litigation have resolved into profitable partnerships within weeks of your involvement. These are positive outcomes," Colonel Rodriguez observed mildly. "I'm struggling to identify the threat to galactic stability." "The threat," interjected the synthetic representative of the machine collective, its optical sensors focusing with mechanical precision, "is that your capabilities exceed your declared specifications by several orders of magnitude. This suggests either deliberate deception about your true nature or the existence of technologies and methodologies that you have not shared with the Council." Thexanael found himself in the unusual position of defending the humans while simultaneously sharing the Council's concerns. "Our analysis indicates that humans achieve their results through advanced understanding of psychological and social dynamics rather than through undeclared technology. They appear to possess intuitive capabilities for system analysis that allow them to identify intervention points that other species cannot perceive." The chamber erupted in overlapping translations as multiple species began speaking simultaneously. The concept that a single species could possess inherent analytical advantages that fundamental to conflict resolution was deeply threatening to civilizations that had spent millennia developing their own approaches to diplomacy and warfare. Dr. Chen raised her hand in a gesture that somehow commanded attention despite humans lacking any telepathic or energy projection capabilities. "May I suggest a different interpretation? Perhaps the issue isn't that we possess unusual capabilities, but that we approach problems from perspectives that other species haven't considered." She gestured to Colonel Rodriguez, who activated a holographic display showing human historical data. "Our species developed on a world where survival required cooperation despite fundamental conflicts of interest. We evolved as tribal hunters who had to work together to take down prey larger and more dangerous than ourselves, while simultaneously competing with each other for limited resources." The display showed Earth's historical progression from scattered tribes to global civilization, highlighting patterns of conflict and cooperation that had shaped human development. "We learned to read social dynamics because misunderstanding could be fatal. We developed strategies for converting enemies into allies because our survival often depended on it. We created technologies for psychological analysis because knowing what others were thinking could mean the difference between successful cooperation and destructive conflict. These skills became fundamental to our civilization," Rodriguez continued. "Every human child learns to recognize facial expressions, interpret body language, understand group dynamics, and navigate complex social hierarchies. We consider this basic social competence, but Apparently, it provides analytical advantages when applied to interspecies conflicts. The Nexary speaker's crystalline structure fluctuated with rapid internal communications before responding. Are you suggesting that your species possesses natural psychological warfare capabilities that you deploy unconsciously? Not warfare, Dr. Chun corrected gently. Communication. We're not manipulating anyone. We're understanding them. When you understand someone's actual motivations, fears, and objectives, it becomes much easier to identify solutions that address their real needs rather than their stated positions. This explanation was somehow more terrifying than accusations of advanced technology or hidden agendas. If humans possessed intuitive social analysis capabilities that allowed them to understand other species better than those species understood themselves, then their influence would continue expanding regardless of their intentions. The Altrian representative, speaking through harmonic vibrations that conveyed emotional undertones lost in most translations, offered a perspective that surprised the assembly. We have worked closely with human special forces teams for 8 months. Their methods are not manipulative or deceptive. They ask questions, listen carefully to answers, and offer suggestions based on analysis of information that everyone already possessed, but no one had properly synthesized. The speaker paused, allowing the translation systems to process the complex harmonic patterns. They helped us resolve our piracy crisis not through superior firepower, but by helping us understand that the pirates were responding to economic pressures we hadn't recognized. Once we addressed the underlying issues, the piracy ended naturally. The humans simply helped us see what was already there. Similar testimonials emerged from representatives of dozens of species that had worked with human teams. The pattern was consistent. Humans listened, analyzed, and offered insights that enabled others to solve their own problems more effectively. Their success rate was so high because they were extraordinarily good at understanding what was actually happening beneath the surface of conflicts. But this raised an even more disturbing question. Admiral Korthax voiced what many in the chamber were thinking. If humans possess such advanced understanding of our psychological and social dynamics, what prevents them from using these capabilities for conquest rather than conflict resolution? The question hung in the chamber's atmosphere like a toxic cloud. Every representative present understood its implications. A species that could consistently predict and influence the behavior of other civilizations could theoretically subvert galactic civilization without firing a single weapon or violating a single treaty. Dr. Chin's response was simple and completely terrifying. Nothing prevents it except our choice not to do so. The silence that followed stretched for several minutes as the implications settled into every mind present. Humans had essentially admitted that they possessed capabilities that could destabilize galactic civilization, and that the galaxy's security depended entirely on their continued commitment to using those capabilities constructively. However, Colonel Rodriguez added, I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding our motivations. We're not interested in conquest or control, because both approaches are incredibly inefficient ways to achieve our actual objectives. Which are? Demanded the Regelian admiral. Stability, prosperity, and continued survival for everyone involved. Conquest creates resistance, which leads to ongoing conflict, which consumes resources and creates unpredictable outcomes. Control requires constant maintenance and eventually breaks down as control populations develop resentment. But cooperation that benefits everyone involved becomes self-maintaining and generates expanding returns over time. Dr. Chin nodded. We help resolve conflicts because stable, prosperous civilizations are better neighbors than unstable, desperate ones. We share our analytical methods because educated allies make better partners than ignorant ones. We've learned that the most effective way to ensure our own security and prosperity is to ensure everyone else's security and prosperity. The chamber erupted again as representatives struggled to process this perspective. The concept that a species might pursue influence and power specifically to give it away was contrary to every model of interspecies relations that galactic civilization had developed. The Nexary speaker finally restored order. Are you claiming that humans seek power in order to create conditions that make power unnecessary? Exactly. Both humans responded simultaneously. The mathematical implications made Thexenal's tentacles writhe with involuntary stress responses. If humans were systematically creating conditions that reduced conflict while increasing cooperation, they were essentially restructuring galactic civilization to operate according to principles that made human-style conflict resolution capabilities less necessary over time. They were changing the galaxy in ways that would eventually make their own advantages irrelevant. It was either the most enlightened approach to interspecies relations in galactic history, or the most sophisticated long-term strategy for species dominance ever conceived. The emergency session ended without formal resolution, but with an implicit understanding that had fundamentally altered the balance of galactic politics. Humans had revealed capabilities that made them potentially the most influential species in known space, while simultaneously demonstrating that their primary objective was to create conditions that would make such influence unnecessary. As the representatives dispersed, each carried the same disturbing realization. They were witnessing the emergence of a species that could reshape galactic civilization without conquest, subversion, or coercion. Humans were winning by helping everyone else win, and the cumulative effect was approaching something that transcended traditional concepts of victory entirely. The galaxy was about to discover whether this transformation represented evolution or extinction for the civilization they had built over millennia of careful balance between competing powers. And the most terrifying aspect was that the choice might no longer be entirely their own to make. The Watchers, ancient artificial intelligences left behind by the first spacefaring civilization, had detected the anomaly as it passed through the cosmic void between the Milky Way and Andromeda. Their initial reports had been dismissed as sensor malfunctions or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. Space was vast, and the idea that something could traverse the emptiness between galaxies was beyond the theoretical framework of most species. But the Watchers had been designed to monitor cosmic-scale threats, and their warnings became increasingly urgent as the anomaly approached. It wasn't a natural phenomenon or a collection of rogue objects. It was a fleet. Admiral Korthak stood before the assembled War Council, his tactical displays showing sensor readings that challenged every assumption about what was possible in space warfare. The entity has decelerated from near-light speed travel and entered our galaxy through the galactic halo region. Current projections indicate it will reach the outer rim systems within 18 months. The holographic displays showed a formation that defied comprehension. Thousands of vessels arranged in geometric patterns that spanned light years, moving with coordinated precision that suggested a level of organization and technology that exceeded anything in galactic records. Individual ships were larger than most space stations, and the energy signatures indicated power generation capabilities that could sterilize entire star systems. Estimated combat capacity, asked the Nexary speaker, its crystalline structure flickering with rapid internal calculations. Unknown. Our analysis suggests that a single vessel from this fleet possesses sufficient firepower to eliminate any defense force in known space. The entire formation appears capable of sterilizing inhabited systems faster than we could evacuate them. The War Council had been hastily assembled as reports filtered in from deep space monitoring stations. Every major military power in the galaxy had representatives present, along with the human delegation that had been included despite their nominal classification as special forces. The irony was not lost on anyone present that humanity's recent demonstrations of influence had earned them a seat at the table just as the galaxy faced its first existential threat in recorded history. Dr. Chun studied the tactical displays with the same analytical focus she had brought to every crisis over the past 2 years. Have there been any attempts at communication? Negative, responded the Vortex Queen, her harmonic tones carrying undertones of frustrated anxiety. The fleet has ignored all broadcast frequencies and communication protocols. They appear to be conducting systematic scans of inhabited systems, but have not responded to contact attempts. Colonel Rodriguez frowned at something in the sensor data. These movement patterns, they're not random. This fleet is gathering intelligence on our defensive capabilities, population distributions, and resource locations. This is reconnaissance preceding invasion. The statement hung in the chamber's atmosphere like a death sentence. Every species present understood the implications. If the approaching fleet was conducting pre-invasion reconnaissance, then galactic civilization was facing an enemy that could destroy them before they could mount any meaningful defense. Combined fleet engagement scenarios? Asked the synthetic collective representative, its optical sensors analyzing probability matrices with mechanical precision. Admiral Korthax's display shifted to show tactical projections that painted a grimly one-sided picture. Every simulation indicates total defeat within 72 hours of engagement. The enemy's technological advantages are too significant to overcome through conventional military strategies. We lack the firepower, defensive capabilities, or strategic mobility necessary to contest their advance. The chamber fell silent as the mathematical reality settled into every mind present. Galactic civilization had spent millennia developing military technologies and strategic doctrines to manage conflict between relatively comparable forces. None of their planning had anticipated facing an enemy with such overwhelming advantages that traditional warfare became meaningless. Evacuation scenarios, whispered the Altrian representative, its harmonic patterns conveying the desperation that every species was feeling. Insufficient time and transportation capacity, Korthax replied grimly. Full evacuation of inhabited systems would require several centuries using current capabilities. The approaching fleet will reach population centers within 18 months. Dr. Chun had been studying the sensor readings with increasing intensity, occasionally exchanging glances with Colonel Rodriguez that suggested rapid, silent communication. Finally, she looked up from the displays with an expression that somehow managed to convey both concern and curiosity. Admiral, these scan patterns suggest the fleet is specifically gathering intelligence on military installations and defensive capabilities. Have they shown any interest in civilian populations or non-military infrastructure? Korthax consulted his data streams. Scans have focused primarily on military assets, industrial capacity, and resource extraction operations. Civilian population centers have received minimal attention. Communication attempts have been ignored, but have there been any hostile actions? Weapon deployments, shield activations, attack formations? Negative. The fleet maintains defensive formations but has not demonstrated aggressive posturing beyond the reconnaissance activities. Rodriguez leaned forward. What if they're not planning an invasion? What if they're conducting a threat assessment? The suggestion sparked rapid discussion throughout the chamber as representatives considered implications that hadn't occurred to their military analyses. If the approaching fleet was assessing rather than preparing to attack, then their intentions might be negotiable. Assessment for what purpose? Demanded the Nexary speaker. Dr. Chin stood and activated her own holographic display, showing patterns that her analysis had extracted from the sensor data. Every species develops reconnaissance protocols based on their own strategic thinking. These patterns suggest the fleet is evaluating our capacity for resistance, but also our technological development level, social organization, and resource utilization efficiency. Her display highlighted subtle elements in the fleet's behavior that had been overlooked by military analysis. Movement patterns that suggested multiple independent command structures, scanning priorities that indicated interest in civilian achievements as well as military capabilities, and formation changes that appeared to be responses to communications attempts rather than ignoring them. They're not ignoring our communications, she continued. They're analyzing them. Every transmission we send is providing them with information about our languages, technology, social structures, and decision-making processes. They're learning about us the same way we would learn about them if our positions were reversed. Colonel Rodriguez activated additional displays showing human analysis of the fleet's reconnaissance patterns. This is first contact protocol for a civilization that has encountered hostile species before. They're determining whether we represent a threat to be eliminated, a resource to be exploited, or a potential ally to be contacted. The implications sent ripples of possibility and terror through the assembly. If humanity's analysis was correct, then galactic civilization was facing a test rather than certain destruction. But the stakes of that test were the continued existence of every species in the galaxy. "Recommendations?" asked Admiral Corthax, though his tone suggested he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. Dr. Chun exchanged another of those rapid silent communications with Rodriguez before responding. "We need to demonstrate that we're worth preserving without appearing to be a threat. That requires showing advanced technological capabilities while making it clear we're not aggressive, displaying social sophistication while indicating we're not expansionist, and proving we're intelligent while showing we're not dangerous." How do we demonstrate technological advancement to a civilization that can cross intergalactic space? Asked the Vortex Queen. "We don't try to impress them with our weapons or ships," Rodriguez replied. "We impress them with our problem-solving capabilities. We show them that we can achieve complex objectives through intelligence and cooperation rather than through brute force." The chamber erupted as representatives realized what the humans were suggesting. They wanted to demonstrate galactic civilization's value by using the same methods that had made human special forces so effective, by solving problems that appeared impossible through analysis and coordination rather than superior technology. "You're proposing to treat first contact with an intergalactic civilization as a conflict resolution scenario?" asked the synthetic collective representative with mechanical incredulity. "We're proposing to treat it as what it actually is," Dr. Chen corrected. "A communication problem between two civilizations that don't understand each other's capabilities or intentions. The fleet is trying to determine what kind of species we are. Our response will determine whether they conclude we're worth establishing relations with or whether we're an obstacle to be removed." The Nexary speaker's structure flickered with rapid internal deliberation before responding. This approach assumes the fleet represents a rational civilization capable of being influenced by demonstrated competence. If they are aggressive expansionists or resource extractors, displaying our capabilities might simply provide them with better intelligence for conquest. Possible, Rodriguez acknowledged. But every alternative leads to certain destruction. Military engagement guarantees our annihilation. Hiding demonstrates weakness and might trigger elimination. Running is impossible given their technological advantages. Attempting to demonstrate our capabilities is the only strategy that offers any possibility of survival. The discussion that followed stretched for hours as representatives debated options that ranged from desperate to impossible. Military scenarios consistently resulted in total defeat. Diplomatic approaches lacked any foundation for establishing communication. Evacuation plans couldn't move sufficient populations in available time. Only the human proposal offered any theoretical path to survival, but it required galactic civilization to fundamentally transform its approach to the crisis. Instead of preparing for war, they would need to prepare for the most important performance evaluation in galactic history. "What specific capabilities do we demonstrate?" asked Admiral Corthax finally. Dr. Chun smiled with the same expression that had unsettled Thexael during their first meeting 2 years earlier. "We show them what humans have been showing the galaxy. We demonstrate that this civilization is capable of solving complex problems through cooperation, intelligence, and understanding rather than through destruction." She activated displays showing the conflict resolutions that human special forces had achieved across the galaxy over the past 2 years. "We've resolved centuries-old conflicts, transformed destructive competitions into profitable partnerships, and created stability in regions that have been chaotic for millennia. We've done this not through superior firepower, but through superior analysis and communication. We show them a galaxy that has learned to solve problems the way humanity solves problems, Rodriguez added. And we demonstrate that this approach produces better outcomes for everyone involved than traditional methods based on dominance and submission. The proposal was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. If successful, it would establish galactic civilization as worthy of respect and continued existence. If unsuccessful, it would provide the approaching fleet with detailed intelligence about every species' capabilities and weaknesses. But as Admiral Korthax had observed, every alternative led to certain destruction anyway. The vote to implement the human strategy passed with unanimous consent, though many representatives privately suspected they were choosing the method of their civilization's destruction rather than preventing it. Preparations began immediately for the most complex, coordinated demonstration in galactic history. Every species would contribute their unique capabilities to a synchronized display of problem-solving competence designed to prove that galactic civilization possessed value worth preserving. As the fleet continued its approach through the outer rim systems, scanning and analyzing everything in its path, billions of individuals across hundreds of worlds prepared for humanity's most ambitious conflict resolution operation. The stakes were existence itself, and failure would mean the end of everything they had built over millennia of careful balance between competing civilizations. But for the first time since the crisis began, some representatives allowed themselves to feel something that resembled hope. They were about to discover whether human methods could resolve conflicts between civilizations separated by entire galaxies and technological gaps that measured in millions of years of development. The approaching fleet would soon learn why the galaxy had learned to fear the label special forces when applied to humanity. And humanity would discover whether their gift for understanding others extended to species that had evolved under entirely alien stars.